A few months ago, my son came home from school and he said to me, "Dad, we learned in school today everything is made out of matter." And we had a discussion about that at that point. But without getting into what we discussed and how I would say I disagreed with that statement, I do think that this idea that the world is made out of matter is very much one of the prevailing philosophical traditions in our world today. There are other things that want to impinge in on it. There are little spiritualisms that you can't ever get rid of. People just tend to pop into their horoscopes and to wearing weird crystals and saying like, well, I don't really believe it, but however, you can always bang those things down with materialism, with saying, we've looked at that crystal, we saw the structure of it, we did these experiments, there was no effect. Your crystal is not a real thing. Stop believing in your crystal. And I think we think of this idea as a very modern one. You might even call this the modernist idea. But I've been very interested lately in tracing this philosophy back, because my feeling is that we are trapped in this web of ideas that we don't understand, that we have come through thousands of years of history of people philosophizing and thinking and trying to figure things out, and we're sort of at the tip of what their spear has been driving forward, and here we are just sort of blithely going along thinking, yeah, we thought of all this, we're great, this is not like anything that's been before. Exaggeration, I realize probably not very many people are quite that hubristic, but the materialist philosophy is actually super old. It goes back to these Greek philosophers. They're pre-Socrates, right? So before philosophy as a discipline really gets its feet under it, there are already guys saying, "Hey Dad, everything is made out of matter." They probably didn't say it to their dad, but they come from this area, Miletus. I believe it's an island, although I'm not 100% sure. And these materialists construct this idea of atoms. Now, initially, one of the big debates that people are having about atoms is, how do they move? Now, this might seem obvious to you because you're thinking in a certain way of like, okay, there's an atom, there's space, the atom moves in the space, no big deal. But the pre-Socratics had a lot of thoughts on what this space was. There's a guy named Parmenides who says, now listen, you guys who say everything is made out of material, where is the material? And the materialists, and then we're gonna start with Democritus. There may be earlier guys than Democritus, but Democritus is really the guy who, when you look in your science textbook, he puts this idea of atoms on the map. And Democritus says the atoms move around in this void. This void is nothingness. The atoms are something, and the void is nothing, and the atoms move in it. And Parmenides is like, you just said that nothing is. What is nothing? How can nothing is? Nothing can't is. That's not a thing. Non-existent can't exist. So where your atoms be at? And Democritus comes back to him and he says, okay, bud, what's your idea? And he says, everything's just packed together. It's just stuff and stuff and stuff all the way down. There's all stuff everywhere. And Democritus says, okay, buddy, how does anything move? And Parmenides is like, It doesn't. And Democritus says, and then Parmenides says, hey Zeno, go invent some proofs that nothing can move. And Zeno says, I'm on it, boss. I got some proofs here that nothing can move. And Democritus just keeps going. Because it's silly to think that nothing can move. Aristotle comes along and solves the problem. A little bit. Alright, he has some ideas, but Democritus presses forward with his idea of atoms and void. Very, very importantly, Democritus says there is nothing but atoms and void. And of course you can hear Parmenides popping up in the background saying, what do you mean there is void? How can this be a void? Alright, Democritus ignores him. He's like, the atom's moving around and stuff that's not. There's stuff that is and stuff that's not, and the stuff that is moves around and the stuff that's not, and it's not really stuff. In the modern age, by the way, this problem still kind of exists, and weirdly enough gets a both and from science, because we have the wave-particle duality problem, and quantum physics tells us that the waves exist everywhere, that there are probabilities and possibilities of particles existing at all points in space, and so there isn't nothing, but there is, kind of. So props to these guys for trying to figure that out with just their brains. Democritus goes on to say, okay, there's nothing but atoms and void. So no spirits that aren't made of atoms. All right, Democritus. I'm not an expert on this. So as I go into this, if you're thinking, I know that he's saying something wrong, well, you're probably right, because I don't have a degree in philosophy, the pre-Socratics, but I have read that Democritus kind of allows for the existence of the gods, but he says they're just really thin sheets of atoms. And this is also how Democritus describes sensation. He says, okay, from the things we look at, and seeing is going to be an important part of this, from the things we look at, little tiny streams of atoms are constantly being emitted from the solid feeling stuff, and those little tiny streams of atoms come into our eyes and interact with our eyes and create sensation. Or, wind would be like an obvious way that the feeling would happen. He says there's little atoms of air, and they're moving around in the void, and they bonk against your skin, and you feel that. And so he kind of allows for the gods, but he's like, well, they exist in physical space. And here's what Democritus says ultimately. He says, because everything is atoms and void, and they're just bouncing off of each other, then everything is determined. There is nothing that we can do about our fate in life. And then he goes on to have like ethics and say things are better than others, and tell you how to live your life. And it's like, wait a minute, Democritus. He makes the mistake that every fatalist makes. It then goes on to tell you how to live your life, even though you can't control it. And Democritus's big contribution is really this idea that he gets rid of the gods. Democritus says, look, either the gods are just stuff like us, or they don't really exist. And they don't care what you do. All right? These are things that are very much in the materialist spiritualism. I know that is a oxymoron in a sense, but I think that it's important to understand that this whole philosophy is kind of fitting together around only stuff, and there's not, in the sense that they would like expect anything out of you or even interact with your life at all, the gods don't exist. Nobody back in this era is going to be brave enough to come out and be full atheist, at least not any of the major players. They all sort of allow for the existence of the gods, but the gods are way out there. All right, they're going to be not worried with what you do. And so you can see again how this is so pervasive in modernity. The modern turn to, well, if there was a god, he definitely doesn't care. You can also see it in deism. Deism takes God, and instead of putting him far away in space, it puts him far away in time. Really has a similar effect, although I would... The problem with the deists is they put God far away back in time, but then they make a deterministic universe, and then they say God made that universe and he doesn't care. Here's the problem with the deist position. If God made the universe to turn out a certain way, deterministically, and he didn't want you killing people, he could have foreseen the people that would kill people and then program in a deterministic karma for them to have happen to them in their life, and you would still have a God that cares about what you do. Even if he's not imminently present, he's still affecting everything around you by reason of the fact that he kicked off the first billiard balls and he knew how they would work out in the end, and he did it on purpose. So deists, get your act together. You got some holes in your philosophy. Regardless, Democritus gets rid of the gods as a player in the world. He also gets rid partly of sensation. Democritus is suspicious of sense data. He looks around and he says, okay, what we're seeing are these little sloughed off atoms that come into our eyes from all of the big atoms that are all together. And Democritus, by the way, before we go further, I want to give him a lot of credit, because he's just sitting around thinking about stuff, okay? This dude, all he has is his brain and his eyeballs, and this is gonna be his main thing. Well, all I've got is my brain and my eyeballs, and I'm gonna try to figure everything out. And he comes up with stuff like light from... He thinks that objects emanate light rather than it being reflected. So he kind of misses that, but he has this idea of like very small particles that bring things to your eyes, and now you can see them. He comes up with these ideas of atomic connections, that okay, different materials behave different ways, they must have different shaped atoms. So Democritus has these uncuttable atoms, but he says some of these atoms have hooks on the sides of them and they're really difficult to pull apart, and so that's why you have things like iron. And some of these atoms are slippery and so they move around like water, and some of these atoms are pokey and that's why things taste sour sometimes. It's a crude metaphor for what ultimately ends up being atomic bonds, but give the guy a break. He's living more than 2,000 years ago, just sitting around thinking about stuff. It's amazing that he comes up with this at all. This is very much what we would understand in our modern science. And if you really want to get the full sort of Democritus, and we're going to get to Epicurus in a little bit. Epicurus, not Epicurus. Anyway, we were going to get him in a minute, but you can actually download the audiobook of Lucretius's poem about this philosophy called On the Nature of Things. And On the Nature of Things is an amazing laying out of this Democritean / Epicurean idea of materialism and atomism, and you will have your mind blown about how much they get right. That Lucretius even goes into Brownian motion. He just says, well, if you look around at like little specks of stuff floating in the air, you can probably imagine that there's smaller things that are kind of bouncing around and hitting them, because you can see little dust motes that'll bounce up and down and around, and so probably there's little tinier atoms that we can't see that are bouncing into them, and that's what makes stuff move. And you're like, Lucretius, how you do this? How you come up with Brownian motion in like not even AD, it's BC, it's BC times. Lucretius. There's a really incredible power to this from a modern scientific perspective, the fact that these guys come up with as much as they do. But Democritus doesn't trust the senses. Democritus says, okay, if the colors that I see are a reaction from the effluences of these many larger things bouncing into my eyes, then the color doesn't actually exist in the item. It exists in the way that my mind interacts with the item, but it's not a fundamental property. And he even talks about other things, hot and cold. He says, sure, hot and cold, the sensation, but really, atoms and void. And he puts himself in an interesting bind because he still wants to have access to truth. He says truth is in an abyss, right? I've heard it also translated well. It's like, truth is really hard to get to, you guys, because sure, we have these sensations, but also we're limited in our encounter with the real thing. And it really, really prefigures Kant's ideas of the thing in itself and the phenomenal world. And I have other stuff that I want to say about Kant and this whole division between the thing in itself and the phenomenal world. I hope to make another video, but I'm not going to make that video now. But Democritus has this sense of, okay, the real world, which is actually made out of atoms and nothing else, doesn't have these properties like color and hot and cold and even, anything that is sense-based. And yet he doesn't want to give up on the notion of being able to access truth. He says, okay, we don't get the truth through our sensations, but we can think our way there. We can pure reason. Here comes Kant again. Kant, you can't be in this video. We're doing more stuff later with Kant if I ever figure him out. We can have this sensation of pure reason, and he sort of imagines cutting himself off from the senses and just thinking, and he says somehow, some way, we may be able to reach an idea of truth with just reason. But again, he's going to reject. Well, he's not going to reject Plato's ideas of the forms, because Plato hasn't been around to make the idea of the forms yet. Socrates hasn't even been around to inspire Plato to ultimately make the ideas of the form. But he's going to reject physicality. Now, this was originally going to be mostly about Epicurus. Epicurus, as I already mentioned earlier, is a later philosopher who picks up this stuff. Epicurus is after Plato and Socrates, and he's in dialogue and argument with Plato and Socrates. Epicurus has lots of problems with Platonic ideas because he's a big fan of Democritus. Epicurus loves this idea of atom and void. But Epicurus has some issues with the implications of atoms and void and nothing else. First off, Epicurus is like, look, Democritus, mad respect for what you've been putting together. Democritus is dead at this point. But you know what I'm saying? He like, I love all this. Here's my issue. So you got rid of the gods telling us what to do. That was awesome. I like that. I'm going to really hang on to that. And we'll talk about Epicurus' idea of the gods to a point. But you got rid of the gods. Great. But then you stuck us with this determinism that still tells us what to do. What the heck, my dude? I thought we were going to get out of the thumb of, like, you have to do this and you have to do that and some kind of moralistic system, and now we're just locked into things that we have no choice over. Why have you done this? What was the point? We could have just had the gods. So Epicurus wants to reform Democritus a little bit. He also takes issue with Democritus's idea of being able to access truth. He says, Democritus, again, mad respect for all that you did, but you just can't cut out sensation like that. Sensation's all we got, man. Like, all we can do is have sensations. The only things we could ever possibly know about anything come from sensations. For you to say, well, then that we can access truth but not through sensation is kind of an oxymoron. And so Lucretius and Epicurus the Epicureans, they want to create a model of truth that can be built from sensation. Now, they actually get some stuff from Democritus. Democritus leaves them a gap, because one of the things that Democritus says, because don't forget, philosophers back in this day aren't just thinking about ideas. They really want to tell you, how do you improve your life? And Democritus's whole project in telling you about atoms and void and the gods don't exist is to eliminate anxiety. He's saying, hey guys, don't worry about it. It's all good. The gods aren't gonna strike you with lightning for doing the bad thing. But you should stop doing the bad thing. Because it hurts people. And pain is bad. And so Democritus brings up this idea of pain avoidance. He says life is about avoiding pain. And Epicurus really snatches onto this and he says, yes. Yes. Avoiding pain. And here's where I'm going to get you, Democritus, because pain's a sensation. If we're going to build our whole philosophy and the idea of how to live the good life around avoiding pain, we have to admit that some sensation gives us some idea of the truth. So Epicurus brings sensation back in and really makes it kind of a central focal point of his philosophy. He says sensation, yes. Pain, yes. Pain is real. It's felt through atoms. Now, Epicurus doesn't go in for the forms. He doesn't go in for an immortal soul. He does believe in the soul, but he essentially, and again, we got to really have our minds blown by how advanced some of these ideas are for people just sitting around and thinking about stuff in BC times. He essentially invents the idea of the nervous system. He says, yeah, you feel stuff, but it's just this little filaments of atoms that are constructed somehow, and they go throughout your body. And when your body dies, all those little filaments are disrupted, and so then you're not a person anymore. And he makes the argument, again, because he's trying to make you live the good life. And he wants you to avoid pain. So Epicurus makes the argument, you might be worried about the fact that you're not going to exist. But chill, because you didn't exist before you were born, and that didn't hurt. You're never worried about the fact that at a certain point before you were born, you didn't exist, and now you do, and it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay not to exist again. It didn't hurt not existing before. It's not going to hurt existing after. By the way, the first exposure I had to this idea was on the very first episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where one character describes this philosophy to another character and says, this is why we shouldn't be afraid of dying. And then because the show is run by hypocrites, they still have the characters be saved from dying. Because, you know what? That's not actually very comforting, ultimately, to the vast majority of the viewing public. Thanks for introducing us to Epicurism. Also, we want our characters to live on forever. So Agent Coulson comes in with a helicopter and saves him. I think it's... Oh, no, it's Nick Fury. They get like a Nick Fury cameo. This is a tangent. Let's move on. So Epicurus says, chill out about death and chill out about the gods. Epicurus is very smart at this time. He does not say the gods don't exist. He kind of allows for them to be non-material. And here's a hole in Epicurus that I don't understand. Epicurus, there is a sense in Epicurus where void doesn't have to be nothing. It just has to be something that doesn't interact with matter. And so he can take the gods and place them in this non-material realm and say they don't interact with matter, so don't worry about it. So they don't matter. They still exist, but they don't actually affect anything, so chill. He doesn't do that, though. Instead, he goes back to the pain avoidance thing. He says, okay, the gods are completely and totally wise and perfect. And so they're not in the realm of the forms like Plato. But what we're going to do is we're going to say the gods wouldn't be affected by pain. The gods are not going to come down here and feel this common pain that we all understand that we should try to avoid pain. Everybody looks at pain and they say, ow, I don't want that. Your experience tells you shouldn't be in pain, is what I'm saying this, and I want you to understand this is Epicurus's standpoint. I might come up with some objections to this in a minute. But okay, we're going to completely avoid pain. Epicurus, by the way, and the term Epicurean is really kind of synonymous with hedonism today. Epicurus is all about what you can call pleasure, but he's very weirdly nuanced about it. He doesn't fall into the trap of saying, let's do endless lines of cocaine and have as much sex as possible. He's actually kind of weirdly ascetic in his approach to pursuing pleasure. He says the greatest pleasure that is possible is the absence of pain. And all other types of pleasure are just variations on that. If you find that somewhat unconvincing, I mean, join the club, so do I. But this is the argument that Epicurus makes. And it does get him out of practical problems. I don't think it's a good argument, but I respect him for making it. I think that there's this interesting problem where sometimes when we take nearly any philosophy to its quote-unquote logical conclusion, we can get ourselves into a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And there's something to be said for somebody who like develops a philosophy that ends in, and I should feed my wife into the wood chipper. And then they pull back from that and they say, I know I shouldn't feed my wife into the wood chipper, so I'm going to add some stuff in and fix the philosophy. And it's not really going to fit, but also like, good job, you didn't feed your wife into the wood chipper. You didn't do stupid things with your philosophy. So Epicurus, he comes up with this workaround where he says, okay, don't drink a lot. Partly because it's going to cause you pain later, right? You're going to be drunk later. You're going to feel gross. So if you just have a little bit or whatever and kind of maybe help you go to sleep, fine. But like, don't get a hangover. That's pain. We're trying to avoid that. Don't have like endless amounts of sex because, that's going to cost you, right? In some way or another. Potentially you're going to have kids. By the way, major flag for sort of Epicureanism and modernity butting up together is Epicurus is an antinatalist. He says, I'm telegraphing my problems with this ahead of time. I should not jump ahead of the story, but he says, kids could cause you pain. All right. He's not a woman, right? So he doesn't even have the like, avoid the pain of childbirth thing to go on, because if you're an Epicurean, and you're a woman, you definitely should never have kids. Right? You're trying to avoid pain. Childbirth hurts. Let's stay away from that. But even as a man, Epicurus is like, yeah, but kids can be kind of a lot of trouble, and they might cause you grief in the future, and it's sort of a wash if you have kids or not. Maybe they'll cause you some pleasure, but they'll probably also bring you a lot of grief. Don't have kids. I don't think he says that in the letter to his mom that he writes. I think that's in a different letter. He does have a famous letter to his mom. It's tough to be consistent with this stuff. Thanks for bringing me into the world and giving me the life that would create the mind, that would create an entire philosophy that would dominate hundreds of years of human civilization, but also kind of a dumb move to have me, Mom. Like I said, I'm telegraphing. The other thing that Epicurus does, and I started to talk about this earlier, he's annoyed by the fact that everything's determinist in Democritus. And so he says, Democritus, thanks for all these atoms. They're great. Everything's made out of them. There's nothing that's not an atom. But we're going to introduce something to the atoms that will bring back at least randomness and maybe choice. And Epicurus creates this idea called the swerve. Now, as far as I can tell, he kind of justifies it. He has a reasonable idea of, okay, atoms, he talks about atoms falling, which we can forgive, right? But obviously there's some problems there. But I'm going to modernize his idea a little bit and say, let's say we have atoms that come out from an explosion. There's just an emanating point of atoms, right? The Big Bang, as we would call it now. So here's an emanation of atoms. If all of these atoms are flying off from this central point at high speed, why would they ever bounce into each other? They should never contact each other, and he doesn't have an idea of gravity. I mean, he knows that things come down, right? So his initial thing is falling down, but he doesn't have that as a force, really. So he's like, if they never contact each other, why does anything ever happen? Stuff needs to happen. The atoms can't just be going in straight lines forever. So I'm going to introduce this idea called the swerve. And essentially the swerve is like, for some reason the atoms changed direction. We don't know why, but now we have free will back. Yay! It's lazy philosophy. It doesn't really fit with the atomistic idea. And there's a book that I read. This was actually my introduction to this topic. It's called The Swerve. That's literally the title. And then the subtitle is How the World Became Modern. And the entire plot of the book hinges on the rediscovery of Lucretius's poem on the nature of things. De Rerum Natura. It's a Latin. All right. And this poem got basically buried because Christianity comes along. Christianity is like, what you doing with your philosophy with no gods in it? We don't like this. We like Aristotle. Aristotle says there's no void. You got your void in your thing. We got these atoms. We don't like this atoms. Again, there's another idea I want to make eventually about Catholics and atoms and what their problem with atoms is, but they don't like atoms. Thomas Aquinas really doesn't like atoms. So we're going to get rid of atoms. And so Lucretius essentially gets buried. He does get buried in a monastery, weirdly enough. The Christians preserve these works, and they stick them on a shelf somewhere, but they're like, no. Lucretius, Epicurus, Democritus, you guys are right out. We're going forward with the god. And the gods underneath him, those exist. Sorry, guys, your atoms had their day and they're done. And this book, The Swerve, talks about how at a certain point, the Catholic Church, and it's funny how it's like the Catholic Church gets rid of it, and it's also the Catholic Church that brings it back. It's just because there's all these different factions and people and individuals, because everybody's a Catholic at a certain point, and so it's just like, well, you've got Catholics that are humanists and Catholics that are materialists and Catholics. So these guys are looking to bring back all these ancient classical Greek ideas into the world. And I believe the man's name is Poggio, goes around and investigates all of these monasteries and finds de rerum natura, right? On the nature of things. And like the premise of the swerve is that the glorious wonders of modernity that we experience, thanks Lucretius, you brought all that to us. And yeah, to an certain extent, yeah, I mean, if you believe that it's a good thing to have science and cars and medicine, then we do have a lot to thank Lucretius for. We lose some stuff in Lucretius, but the point I wanted to make about bringing up this book is that it's really ironic that the swerve is the title, because the swerve as a concept in Lucretius and Epicurus is the least modern logical thing that they have. One of the least modern logical things that they have. The swerve is a anomaly. It's them sort of hacking choice back into the system. And I know the author picks it up because it seems like this good idea. Oh man, the history was on this path towards just endless religion and Catholicism and people believing in God. But then light shone forth and the swerve happened, and now we have modernity. Yay! But the swerve is ascientific, right? Like it's an anomaly introduced because the atomism by itself was actually intolerable to deal with. And so you're bringing experience back in with Epicurus, and you bring in the swerve, and you have these sort of, now I think, like weird holes into this universe constructed by Democritus that Democritus himself kind of left, because you can't get rid of sensation. You can't really live in a world where you say, well, colors aren't real, but like that tree over there is green. I realize the irony of the fact that I'm recording this in black and white and talking about colors, but trust me, there are colors around me. You just can't see them. But there are these flaws built in, and the more you pick at them and the more you think about this philosophy of atomism, the wider, and not just atomism, but Epicureanism in general, the more you pick at it, the wider the gaps become. Because let's start with this idea of sensation and the good being encountered by avoiding pain. Guys, that's a terrible philosophy. I don't want to like dunk too hard on Epicurus, but this is like the biggest issue that he has in my mind. Just as okay, we've made a philosophy, we want to create a world to have the good life. Let's avoid pain. We already touched on a little bit of just, well, the world falls apart if you avoid pain in the form of having kids, right? Women, it's gonna hurt. Even with modern medicine, and they're gonna like sedate you or whatever, like it's still super uncomfortable for 9 months, from what I can gather based on having watched women go through it, and my wife in particular. It is not a fun time, right? And it completely leaves out all kinds of other suffering that benefits, right? If you want to stay in shape, you're going to have to exercise, right? Exercising is going to hurt. Ironically enough, or maybe no, not a paradox. I don't know what word I want to use here, but I was listening to stuff about Epicureanism the other night when I was on my run. I didn't feel comfortable on my run. It didn't help me to avoid pain in the present. But my rationality told me, if you do this on a regular basis, you might be able to avoid pain in the future by staying fit and being healthy. And sometimes I get hungry and I don't eat because my rationality tells me, yes, this it would feel good to eat right now, but it might feel better to be thin in the future and not have heart problems and not have diabetes and not have all of the problems that modern food overconsumption brings to people. So Lucretius is just like right off with the pain avoidance thing. You cannot live like this. And the other thing that's hugely important to remember about this is that if your philosophy is about pain avoidance, I think there's a real sense that you are very, very privileged. And I am very, very privileged. There is, I think I could probably, if I chose to pursue a certain level of Epicurean thought and way of life, I could say I'm gonna just try not to be in very much pain. But I was reading an article about extolling the virtues of Epicurus and his philosophy and why we should be using it today. And it said, well, pain doesn't last for very long most of the time. And so you can just kind of handle it. And if it does last for a while, and Epicurus, he dies in a lot of pain, but he says, well, I have my friends and I'm able to think about the wonderful discussions that we had about philosophy, and so this helps relieve the pain. He writes this really inspiring letter on the last day of his life about how much he values his friends, and I'm not going to dunk on him for that, but there are lots of people who can't avoid pain. Throughout human history and many places in the globe, pain is a real and necessary part of life. You don't ever get away from it completely. And some people don't get away from it at all. If the person who lives with constant pain, how can they be an Epicurean? Do they commit suicide? Epicureanism doesn't leave room for suffering and for meaning in suffering, because Epicureanism gets rid of meaning. It doesn't want to. It doesn't completely get rid of meaning, because Epicurus, like I said, he sees the problem with getting rid of sensation. He says, whoa, how are we supposed to know anything? Again, I want to fast forward to Kant. We're not going to fast forward to Kant. He says, how are we supposed to know anything without sensation? Sensation has to give us some access to the truth, of some kind of truth at least. So he puts the phenomenal world back in place. But once you have the phenomenal world back in place, you have the knower and the agent as an important part of what's going on. And that's not something that's made out of atoms. The idea of sensing things, what your eyes are made out of atoms, sure, but guess what? Like the idea of seeing things is not. That's a construction of your consciousness, which is also, again, dependent on atoms in a certain sense, but not composed of atoms. The other big hole that Epicurus leaves in his philosophy, in my opinion, is that he talks about sensation as our root of knowing. And I'm with him on that. But he actually includes inner sensation. He doesn't just say, well, things you can feel and touch and see and taste, like these are the real things. He says, well, if we're going to have this philosophy of avoiding pain, like you can have inner pain, right? You can undergo psychological, he wouldn't call it psychological, but the psychological suffering that you should avoid, but that is not part of your physical, like, interaction with the world. Again, he's got a physical soul. The physical soul is producing these sensations, but he's saying, well, avoid that psychological pain. By the way, again, the root of modernity we're talking about. Atomism, antinatalism. Epicurus, father of safe spaces, because we're trying to avoid this psychological pain. And I mean, I get it. I understand, you know, I understand why he develops this thing the way he develops it, but it just doesn't completely hold up. It can't ever completely hold up that all you do is just avoid pain. And I'm fascinated, as I said at the beginning, how much of where we are now is rooted in ancient things. And we don't know what they were doing at Miletus, right? These guys who come from Miletus, they develop these very materialistic ideas of the world. And there's part of me that's like, okay, but where did that come from? Because the evolution of thought is incredibly vast. And there are these currents that bubble up, and they have this being that you can't get away from, and they have this power. I want to use spiritual terms to describe them, and I know that'd be a turnoff for a lot of people. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't want to be completely discounted. But it feels like that there are these ideas that, like, sort of have these battles in the minds of, I mean, ultimately thousands and millions of people, and these battles for dominance between, everything's made out of matter, everything's, man, the other side of that, the scary side that nobody wants to talk about, is that everything is made out of things that mean things. The stones would cry out to the timbers, and that you can talk to the sun and the storm, and that they can hear you. We don't have room for that. But it keeps creeping back in anyway. These are my scattered thoughts. I wish that I had been more focused and said, here, like, I have this final endpoint, I'm gonna get there, and boy, we're gonna smash it up. That's not what this ended up being, but I hope that this was instructive to somebody. I hope, whether or not you agreed with sort of my take on it, that it didn't come away from this saying, like, he's completely off his rocker about this idea that we're based in these ancient ideas. I hope that you got a sense, if you didn't have it already, that we're really swimming in a much deeper pool than we think we are. That the things we take for granted are vast and powerful, and the water that we are swimming in is water, right? You don't see it because you're the fish, but look around you, it's there. The thought world exists. Doesn't physically exist. But even Epicurus had to say, well, pain, I encounter it. It must be real in some sense. And that's really the door he leaves open. If the sensation of your eyes can tell you something true about the world, and the sensation of your fingers and the sensation of your taste, if these things can tell you something true, who is to say that the sensation of thought does not encounter a real, true, actually existing world? Epicurus couldn't slam the door on that one. He wants to, but it's still out there. Think on these things, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.